Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I am indeed pleased to contribute to this debate on the Appropriation Bill 2019 for fiscal year 2020. Mr. Vice President, before I continue, I would want to express my congratulations to the Honourable Minister of Finance for his excellent delivery of a well-thought-out, in-depth, comprehensive, meticulously crafted budget presentation to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I also would like to especially commend the very hard-working public. Be quiet, Mr. Vice President. I would also like to commend the very hard-working public officers who assisted the Honourable Minister of Finance in crafting this budget. And he was supported by the Honourable Minister of Planning and Development and her team of public officers. Minister Imber, Mr. Vice President, has demonstrated that the right mix of fiscal, economic, social, and labor policies can realize what I refer to as the SSSG factor. That is stability, strength, satisfaction, and growth. Mr. Vice President, I would take the opportunity to share with this Honourable House and give this Honourable House an update on matters under my portfolio. So let's look at the current labour market context. Mr. Vice President, I will admit that we have seen some difficult times in this country. However, we have overcome many of the challenges and we will continue to succeed. These obstacles, Mr. Vice President, I would want to emphasize, these obstacles are not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. Throughout the world, and particularly the Caribbean region, people have been, quote unquote, feeling the pinch. Mr. Vice President, according to the International Labour Organization, 2018 Labour Overview of Latin America and the Caribbean, the unemployment rate has only modestly improved from 8.1% to 7.8% between 2017 and 2018. In fact, 2018 was the first time in 4 years that the unemployment rate in the region declined. We are expecting this trend of reduced unemployment to continue. And Mr. Vice President, I refer those on the other side, they can go and view the 2018 Labour Overview of Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Vice President, the ILO in its World Employment and Social Outlook Report, Trends 2019, estimated that more than 170 million people worldwide were unemployed in 2018, leading to a global unemployment rate of 5.0%. The report also forecasted that the global unemployment rate is expected to remain essentially unchanged over the next few years, in line with projections pointing to stable global economic growth. Mr. Vice President, Trinidad and Tobago's part of the global economy has unquestionably been impacted by challenging economic conditions over the last few years. This is evident from the rise in the overall unemployment rate for Trinidad and Tobago over the last 3 years. When we look at the quarterly data from the Central Statistical Office, Mr. Vice President, we can see that although the unemployment rate increased from 3.5% in the fourth quarter of 2015 to 3.6% in 2016, and then 4.4% in the fourth quarter of 2017, the unemployment rate is still relatively low. Mr. Vice President, through sound budgetary controls, prudent investment, and fiscal responsibility, Mr. Vice President, I would sit so you could advise those on the other side.
Please, as the Minister is making her contribution, just temper the noise that seems to be elevating just a slight bit in the chamber. Continue, Minister.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, through these sound budgetary controls, we are overcoming the obstacles and achieving success. And although this is our 5th budget presentation, I say with confidence, Mr. Vice President, that this government will be presenting our 6th budget come 2020. Mr. Vice President, I think back to my first contribution to a budget debate in this August House. That was, in fact, my inaugural address. And I remember clearly many of the plans that I shared on what the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development would seek to do during my tenure. I am heartened, Mr. Vice President, when I reflect on how much we have been able to achieve so that we have not only talked the talk, but we have walked the walk. Mr. Vice President, this year, the Ministry of Labor has been on the ground, reaching out to people throughout this great nation. This has allowed me to hear the voices of the people, people who have put their shoulders to the proverbial wheel, trying to earn a living as productive members of this society. And that is why, Mr. Vice President, after careful analysis, we have chosen to increase the minimum wage from $15 to $17.50. And Mr. Vice President, I would want to seize the opportunity to point out to those on the other side and to reassure the members of this society that this government did not pluck $17.50 out of a hat. Under the Industrial Relations Act of 1972, as amended, there is a mechanism that is called the Minimum Wages Board, whose responsibility it is to advise the Minister of Labor on fixing of wages for different classes of workers. And that committee, which, if you're permitting me, Mr. Vice President, that committee is chaired by Ms. Judith Sobian. Other members of that committee, Ms. Sangita Bundu, our senior legal officer at the ministry, Mr. Hayden Manzano, Acting Director, Economic Research and Policy Coordination, Mr. Brian Ruplal, Ms. Cindy Joseph, Mr. Ozzy Warwick of JTAM, Mr. Douglas Williams, and Ms. Namala Lal. That committee made a recommendation to increase the minimum wage earlier this year. I took that report by way of a cabinet note on June 10th to cabinet, submitting the recommendations. And the recommendation of the Minimum Wages Board was to increase the minimum wage from $15 to $18.25. But, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance and his team of economists, after crunching the numbers, they identified that the economy could only have taken an increase of $17.50. So it was through analysis. It was not a figure plucked out of midair. I also want to point out, Mr. Vice President, that when we look at the CARICOM region, the minimum wage is $15.87. This minimum, CARICOM. This minimum wage increase that this government has given the workers of this country seeks to provide a decent wage that balances both the needs of employees and employers as we continue to promote decent work and protect those most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Vice President, We have also increased the wages of CPEP and URP workers and contractors, persons who receive some of the lowest wages in the country. We have increased it by 15%. I would like to assure my colleague on the independent bench, Senator Sipasad, I would want to allay her fears when she pointed out that unions would use this increase as a barometer. Unions cannot use this increase because these are workers at the base level, the lowest levels in society, and therefore unions will they'll have to look for another factor to use in putting forward their case for an increase in salaries. These measures, Mr. Vice President, highlights this administration's continued commitment to ensuring that all citizens achieve a decent living wage to support themselves and their families. Mr. Vice President, similarly, there is a cadre of workers in this country who, when they retire, they do not receive a pension, they receive a lump sum payment. And therefore, this government took a decision that we would grant them a pension. I sat here and I listened to my colleague, Senator Wade Mark, ranting and raving hysterically at times. But what he failed to point out was that his government, his party sat in government for 5 years, and despite all the lobbying that the daily paid union took, they never listened to them and gave them a pension. This government has set the records correct. I want to point out also, Mr. Vice President, that I am aware that the National Union of Government and Federated Workers, popularly known as NUGFW, would have lobbied for years for this pension, starting with the former President General Selwyn John, also Robert Giuseppe, and after Robert Giuseppe, we have Comrade Lambert James, lobbying for this pension. It took this government, Mr. Vice President, to listen to the cries of that union and to agree to introduce a contributory pension. The issues that Senator Wade Mark raised, those administrative procedures that I'm quite sure a meeting between the Chief Personnel Officer and the NUGFW, they will work out the details of this pension. And I can give this House the assurance that not only the union, but the workers whom that union represents, they are extremely happy with this proposal in the budget. Mr. Vice President, these new measures not only brings greater income stability to low-wage earners, but also empowers them to plan better for themselves, their children, and their family. Mr. Vice President, I turn now to labor legislation reform. My colleague Wade Mark had a lot of questions to ask, but he's not here. So I hope that Senator Haynes or Amin would convey to him the response. He should be in the chambers. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, he like your leader, always missing in action. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President.
Minister, Senator Hussain, it's okay. I think you're well aware of the fact that shouting across the floor to the minister is not allowed. Not na, 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 na. I'm telling you, it's not allowed. Understand?
I understand.
Thank you. Minister, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. You see,
I just said. Continue, Minister.
Mr. Vice President, I will claim injury time. But you see, Mr. Vice President, they like to give, but they can't take. Sit quietly and take it. Mr. Vice President, I want to reiterate the commitment of this government to the creation of decent work opportunities. One of the most critical ways in which the Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprise Development seeks to achieve this is through the development and reform of labour legislation. Mr. Vice President, in 2015, I declared that a comprehensive review of all labour legislation in Trinidad and Tobago would take place, and so said, so done. But I want to emphasize that the labour legislative reform is as a result of a signed memorandum of agreement between the Joint Trade Union Movement and the People's National Movement that was signed in 2015. And we are keeping faith. So that, Mr. Vice President, since then, Team Mulsed, as we popularly call ourselves across the ministry, because I have a great team that I work with under the leadership of our Permanent Secretary, Ms. Natalie Willis, and I'm very, very pleased with the work of this team. We have embarked on a journey and conducted no less than 30 consultations. And I have a list of them, Mr. Vice President. I will just cite a few because if I cite all, I would run out of time. We looked at the Cooperative Societies Act, consultations were held on them, the Industrial Relations Act, Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, Contract Labor, Friendly Societies Act, Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies Act, the Foreign Labor Contract, Workmen's Compensation Act, the Trade Union Act. We looked at the issue of sexual harassment, occupational safety and health, recruiting of workers, private security legislation, the Employment Exchange Act, the Employment Standard Consultation of Basic Work. So that, Mr. Vice President, we haven't led that consultative process. We would have developed several draft policy position papers that were placed before the cabinet. And they are proposals for the amendments of the Industrial Relations Act, for the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, and the Workmen's Compensation Act. We are in the process of finalizing the policy paper on Occupational Safety and Health Act, as well as the proposed amendment to the Cipriani, and I will say Cipriani Labour College for short, a bill that would form, that has been formulated and will be laid in Parliament. The Friendly Societies Act, which is before the Law Revision Commission, and the Employment Standard Legislation, which is before the Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, another mechanism under the Industrial Relations Act. Mr. Vice President, in this new fiscal, the ministry intends to continue its work and focus on the following: the review and the amendment of the Minimum Wages Act, review and amendment of the Maternity Protection Act, development of legislation to govern HIV/AIDS in the workplace, and development of legislation with respect to sexual harassment. We did lay the policy in Parliament, Mr. Vice President, on March the 8th, International Women's Day, and the legislation is being crafted. Mr. Vice President, these policy position papers that are before Cabinet are well on their way to becoming law. But you see, Mr. Vice President, everything takes time. The process takes time, as it should, because these laws will affect the lives of each and every one of us and should really never be taken lightly. And that is why, Mr. Vice President, we will continue to consult, we will continue to seek the comments and inputs, because the law must be inclusive and unbiased. And for that, Mr. Vice President, I make absolutely no apologies. In fact, when I came into office in 2015, the ministry's stakeholders were up in arms, and that is, Mr. Vice President, not only the trade union movement, but also the entire cooperative sector were up in arms because they lamented the fact that the previous administration had laid legislation on the amendment of the Industrial Relations Act, and the Cooperative Societies Act in Parliament without any consultation with them. It was the first time in the history of this country that the cooperative sector mounted a massive demonstration right outside on the pavement to force the former administration to withdraw that amendment to the legislation. So that, Mr. Vice President, clearly, this administration has not made the same mistake, as we have a very different mindset where we hold firm to the principles of democratic governance and participatory decision-making. Mr. Vice President, in addition to the multitude of consultation, a promise made in 2015 was quickly realized early in our term of office. And I speak to the National Tripartite Advisory Council, another mechanism my colleague Senator Wade Mark raised. And that mechanism, that council was established and its members were appointed on March 15, 2016. Its role is to provide sound and informed multi-sectoral advice to the government on a range of issues, including maintaining industrial peace and harmony, overseeing the imperatives of Vision 2030, and creating additional job opportunities. Mr. Vice President, insofar as our efforts at multipartite stakeholder relationships are concerned, it is no secret that in spite of our early turbulence in getting off the ground, the work being undertaken by NTAC must be publicly recognized. In this regard, I would like to specially express the government's deep appreciation of the very significant inputs which that council has contributed in shaping the policy framework which will form the nucleus legislation for amendments to the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, Chapter 8813, and the Industrial Relations Act, Chapter 8801, both of which we expect will be laid in Parliament by the end of this year. So then, Mr. Vice President, in similar vein, I have ensured that the various tripartite boards and committees under the purview of the Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprise Development, which are in place and actively fulfilling their mandates, are populated with representatives from the three labour bodies: JTAM, Joint Trade Union Movement, NATOC, and FITON, and also populated with representatives from the business sector. That is the ECA, the Employers Consultative Association, and also the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association and the joint chambers, because all the chambers came together jointly and they normally nominate one representative to sit on these bodies. So then, Mr. Vice President, no one can accuse this Minister of Labour of not carrying out my mandate. And therefore, by the ending of this year, we will see the changes, the amendments to the various pieces of legislation, because the consultative process takes time. Mr. Vice President, I turn now to the National Workplace Policy on Sexual Harassment in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, this matter is close to my heart, and the ministry also is of the view that all forms of sexual harassment, whether in employment, education, or training, should be declared unlawful. The policy we have developed is designed to prevent, prohibit, and address sexual harassment at all levels in the workplace and promote ethical workplace practices. The National Workplace Policy on Sexual Harassment for Trinidad and Tobago was approved by Cabinet on March 7, 2019, and laid in Parliament on March 8, 2019. At the end of July 2019, Cabinet also approved the implementation plan for this policy, which includes a public awareness campaign. The next step, Mr. Vice President, is the development of legislation on sexual harassment in the workplace. It is the firm commitment of the government to promote an environment in the workplace where each individual is safe, respected, and their human rights are preserved. The Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprise Development, we are determined to establish that sexual harassment in the workplace is not normal, and those predators who perpetrate such actions will not be exempt from consequences. Mr. Vice President, I turn to the on-the-job training program, popularly called the OJT program. I want to speak firstly on the ministry's effort to increase the employability of young citizens in this country. Mr. Vice President, the on-the-job training program was established in this country in the year 2002 under our former Prime Minister Patrick Augustus Mervyn Manning. It is a 2-year training program targeted for our young people between the ages of 16 to 35 years, a period of 24 months. And these young persons are afforded the opportunity to gain experience and induction into the world of work and a foothold in the labor market through quality and structured work-based training. Mr. Vice President, this program also provides an opportunity for public and private sector organizations to become training providers that mold and shape the young minds to the world of work. And that is very important, Mr. Vice President, because you see, when I became the Minister of Labor, I found a situation where hundreds of OJTs were brought into the system by the former administration and just placed willy-nilly out there with absolutely little work to do. So what kind of work ethic are we passing on to the young people who are the future leaders of this country? So that we restructured the program, Mr. Vice President. So wherever the areas of training and discipline, we place those trainees. We place engineers, we place doctors, we place attorney at law, we place a lot of professionals, Mr. Vice President, in areas where they can obtain the relevant training and experience. Mr. Vice President, while the OJTP is a training program, the government understands that persons are engaged on a full-time basis for a period of 2 years, because the philosophy that guides this program speaks to the fact that the employer who brings on board a trainee, and that employer is reimbursed 60% of the cost. At the end of that 24 months, that employer must be so impressed by the performance of that trainee that that employer would employ that trainee into the organization, and then the trainee would exit from the OJT program into sustainable employment. With this in mind, this administration, Mr. Vice President, has provided not a 10% increase. Since we are in office, we have provided a 20% increase in the stipend of trainees. Because in 2016, the Minister of Finance implemented a 10% increase. And now in 2019, another 10% increase, bringing it to a total of a 20% increase. And these increases attempt to compensate persons for their effort and qualifications. Do you know what that means, Mr. Vice President? It means that more persons will be attracted to the program, and it also means that trainees will not need to forgo income for training and will instead be able to support themselves and contribute to their households while on this program. In addition, Mr. Vice President, as at September 2019, a total of 5,603 active trainees are on this program. As stated by the Honourable Minister of Finance, we will now be working to achieve a target of 8,000. So that, Mr. Vice President, we will be placing almost 3,000 young persons will be coming onto the program. To this end, Mr. Vice President, the on-the-job training program director has commenced an intensive outreach campaign with both public and private sector employers in order to increase the number of training providers on the program and by extension, the number of available placements. And I want to seize the opportunity, Mr. Vice President, to urge all those employers out there, whether from the private sector, from the state sector, to come on board, because we need providers in order to place these additional trainees. In fact, Mr. Vice President, in order to raise awareness of the program, the staff of the OJTP has participated in career fairs throughout various communities that were hosted by churches, secondary schools, tertiary level institutions, and local government bodies. Mr. Vice President, it is this type of collaborative effort that the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development believes in. And we believe that many hearts, many voices creates one vision. Mr. Vice President, I turn my attention now to small business development. On the topic of employment promotion, as you know, applying for jobs and working for someone else is not the only way that we can make a living in society. I've said it before and I will say it again. In order to provide sustainable employment opportunities, this administration has focused on developing the type of environment which encourages the creation of business units and in turn lead to the creation of employment opportunities for others. This government is committed to boosting small business development on 7 critical platforms, including institutional strengthening, enhanced legislation, more in-depth small business training, expanded and customized funding facilities, and the establishment of new business clusters. This was made evident by the Minister of Finance with his announcement of $10 million loan initiative for on-lending to small and medium enterprises, which I wholeheartedly support. And I'm sure my colleague, the Minister of Trade and Industry, will have a lot more to say on that. This initiative will enable these enterprises to more readily access finance for business development, expansion, and startup. Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, through the National Entrepreneurship Development Company Limited, popularly known as NETCO, which is the implementation arm of government's policy on micro and small enterprises, is also working to this effect. In fact, one of NETCO's new programs for this fiscal year is a business accelerator program, which will focus on assisting budding entrepreneurs by access to institutional advisors, a community of associate organizations, and fellow entrepreneurs in starting up for success. Mr. Vice President, NETCO has already given hope to many of our citizens, regardless of race, age, gender, or ethnicity. I do not know how many people have ever visited NETCO's Facebook page. And I invite you, Mr. Vice President, and other members in this hallowed chamber, and by extension the nation, to visit NETCO's Facebook page. But I will tell you now that it has a wealth of information. There are updates on NETCO's services, training programs, business advice, and so much more. It was on their Facebook page that I saw posts in commemoration of International Women's Day that highlighted the stories of women who have received assistance from NETCO. Mr. Vice President, one woman described her inability to get financing from a traditional bank because of her lack of collateral. Now her restaurant is booming. Yet another client shared the independence of owning her own salon. And Mr. Vice President, she indicated she went to NETCO with nothing more than her talent and her business idea. After the training, advice, and financial assistance she received from NETCO, she is now a proud business owner. And Mr. Vice President, it is stories like these that remind us of why we do what we do. and we reconfirm that our labor is not in vain.
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
I wish to take this opportunity to expressly thank the chairman of the board, Mr. Clary Ben, who is the former executive director of the Unit Trust and a recent awardee of a national reward. Mr. Vice President, with regards to the Occupational Health and Safety Health Authority and Agency, they are committed to the health of all workers in this country, and they are in the process of signing off on the updating of the regulations. They also have 4 draft policy papers related to the proposed regulations. Mr. Vice President, those of us at the OSH agency have been very busy. They have undertaken stakeholder engagements, conducting 12 sensitization sessions over a particular period. They have also embarked on a public compliance program in government ministries. Mr. Vice President, with regards to Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, the board continues to work at leading this institution into being one of the leading tertiary institutions in this country. The college offers full-time and part-time programs, and we have much to expect under the new leadership of Dr. Hyacinth Guy. Mr. Vice President, there is so much more that I have to speak about the cooperative development and strengthening the program, what is planned for the cooperative sector. I want to take the opportunity to issue to the members of staff that during this process of transformation, no one will lose their jobs. It is that there will be need for the cooperative division to continue to exist because we do have non-financial cooperatives, and therefore we will embark on institutional strengthening of that division. Mr. Vice President, as I close, there's so much more that I have to say, the HIV/AIDS policy, labor migration policy, and so much more, but I do not have the luxury of time. As I close, I wish to reiterate that this government has a plan and a vision that would result in sustainable development and economic growth and great success. It is my desire, Mr. Vice President, that we continue to work together for the good of this nation and for the good of our people. I will end with a quote by American industrialist Henry Ford, who said, and I quote, "Coming together is a beginning. Staying together is progress, and working together is success." Mr. Vice President, if we care about this country, we will join hands in order to continue building and developing this great nation that we call Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.